When 56-year-old Eleanor Mitchell reluctantly inherited her estranged uncle's seemingly worthless mountain ranch in Colorado, everyone told her to sell it immediately. But when her desperate search for valuable timber led to the discovery of a hidden cave containing over $5.7 million in lost Apollo mission equipment, she proved that sometimes the most unexpected inheritances lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to the pine trees as Eleanor Mitchell parked her weathered Toyota Corolla at the county assessor's office in Summit County, Colorado. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a manila envelope containing the deed to her newly inherited property. The small brass plaque on the office door read, "Property Records Division." For most people, an unexpected inheritance would be welcome news. For Eleanor, it felt like one more complication in an already overwhelming life. 3 months earlier, Eleanor's world had been upended by a phone call from a lawyer she'd never met about an uncle she barely remembered. "Ms. Mitchell," the voice had said, "I'm calling regarding the estate of Walter Mitchell. As his only living relative, you've inherited his property in Summit County, Colorado. Approximately 180 acres of mountain land with a small cabin. The property taxes are significantly in arrears, and you'll need to make a decision about the property within 90 days. Eleanor had almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Her life was already in free fall. At 56, she had been laid off from her job of 23 years as an administrative assistant at a community college that was downsizing. Her modest savings were dwindling rapidly, her health insurance had expired, and she had just been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The treatment would be expensive, even with the assistance program she'd found. An inherited property with tax problems was the last thing she needed. I remember sitting in that county office, staring at the property records, thinking this inheritance was just one more burden, Eleanor would later recall. The taxes alone were over $14,000 in arrears, and I had exactly $17,852 in my savings account, money I needed for my cancer treatments. My daughter Andrea kept calling from Seattle, telling me to just sign whatever papers I needed to refuse the inheritance. But something wouldn't let me walk away that easily. Eleanor's financial situation was precarious, but it wasn't unique. Job displacement for workers over 50 had become increasingly common, and age discrimination made finding new employment challenging. Medical expenses were the leading cause of bankruptcy in America, and Eleanor was teetering on that precipice. What made Eleanor's story different was what she did next. The property records painted a bleak picture. The 180 acres were in a remote part of Summit County, about 90 minutes from the nearest town. The land was steep, largely forested, and accessed only by a poorly maintained dirt road that became impassable during heavy snow. The cabin was described as uninhabitable in the most recent assessment, with no electricity, running water, or modern amenities. The property had been in the Mitchell family for generations, but had fallen into disrepair during her uncle's later years. Eleanor stared at the topographical map of the property, tracing the contour lines with her finger. "It looks like the middle of nowhere," she murmured to herself. The county assessor, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, overheard her. "That's the old Mitchell place," Patricia said. "Your uncle was quite a character. Lived up there alone for nearly 40 years. People called him Mountain Mitchell. He rarely came into town." "Did you know him?" Eleanor asked, surprised by this personal connection. Patricia nodded. Everyone around here knew Walter. He was eccentric, had all sorts of theories about government secrets and hidden treasures. The local kids used to make up stories about him. "Sounds like I come from a family of outcasts," Eleanor said with a wry smile. Her own father, Walter's brother, had left when she was just 7. She had no memories of ever meeting Uncle Walter. He wasn't crazy, if that's what you're thinking, Patricia said. Just private. He was actually quite brilliant, had an engineering background from what I understand. Worked for some government contractors back in the 60s and 70s, before moving up to the mountains permanently. This small detail caught Eleanor's attention. Her father had also been an engineer, though he'd never achieved much success. Perhaps there was more to this inheritance than an old cabin and tax problems. The property isn't worth much, Patricia continued, but it is beautiful up there. The views are spectacular, and there's a lovely creek running through the lower section. In another location, it might be valuable, but it's just too remote and difficult to develop. Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. I'd like to see it before I decide anything, she said. The drive to the property the next day tested both Eleanor and her aging Toyota. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track that wound steeply up the mountainside. Pine and aspen trees crowded the narrow path, branches occasionally scraping against the car's windows. After nearly an hour on the increasingly primitive road, Eleanor began to wonder if she'd made a wrong turn. Then suddenly, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin that could generously be described as rustic. The logs were weathered gray, the roof sagged visibly in the middle, and the small porch tilted precariously to one side, but the setting was undeniably breathtaking. Behind the cabin, the land rose steeply, covered in dense pine forest. In front, the clearing gave way to a spectacular view of the valley below and mountains beyond. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So this is what you left me, Uncle Walter, Eleanor murmured, stepping out of her car. The mountain air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. The silence was profound, no traffic noise, no humming of electrical appliances, just the whisper of wind through trees and the distant sound of what must be the creek Patricia had mentioned. Eleanor approached the cabin cautiously. The porch. Steps creaked ominously under her weight. The front door was secured with a padlock, but the key had been included in the packet from the lawyer. It took some jiggling, but eventually the lock opened with a rusty protest. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule. A layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise, it looked as though Uncle Walter had just stepped out for a moment. A coffee cup sat on the small wooden table. Books lined rough wooden shelves along one wall. A pot-bellied stove dominated the main room, with a stack of firewood beside it. A narrow doorway led to what appeared to be a small bedroom. But what caught Eleanor's attention were the papers. Every surface was covered with notebooks, loose papers, maps, and diagrams. Some were pinned to the walls, others stacked in precarious piles on the floor. At first glance, they appeared to be the ramblings of a madman, complex calculations, strange diagrams, and cryptic notes in a cramped, meticulous handwriting. Eleanor picked up one of the notebooks and began to leaf through it. The technical terminology was beyond her understanding, but the precision of the drawings and the systematic organization suggested a highly ordered mind, not the chaos of mental illness. Many pages contained references to Apollo, NASA, and mission equipment. There were detailed drawings of what appeared to be components of spacecraft or satellites. What were you up to, Uncle Walter? Eleanor wondered aloud. She spent the remainder of the day exploring the cabin and immediate surroundings. The structure was in poor condition, but not beyond repair. The roof needed immediate attention, and the plumbing was primitive at best, but the foundation appeared solid. Behind the cabin, she found a small shed that contained tools and equipment, all meticulously organized despite years of disuse. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor realized she would need to head back down the mountain before dark made the treacherous road even more dangerous. She gathered a few of the notebooks to examine more closely and locked up the cabin. That evening, in her motel room in the nearest town, Eleanor began reading through Uncle Walter's notebooks more carefully. Many of the technical details were beyond her understanding, but a narrative began to emerge. Walter Mitchell had indeed worked for a government contractor connected to NASA during the Apollo era. His notes mentioned specific missions and equipment, often with references to recovery and storage. One page in particular caught her attention. It contained a crude map of the property with an X marked on the steep, forested section behind the cabin. The notation beside it read, "Storage Site Alpha, secure and stable. All equipment preserved according to protocols. Complete inventory in red notebook." Eleanor searched through the materials she'd brought from the cabin, but couldn't find the red notebook referenced. It must still be at the cabin. She fell asleep that night with her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she'd discovered. The next morning, Eleanor made 2 important phone calls. The first was to her daughter, Andrea, a software engineer in Seattle. "Mom, please tell me you're not seriously considering keeping that property," Andrea said when Eleanor explained what she'd found. "I'm not sure yet," Eleanor replied. "But there's something interesting about Uncle Walter's background. He worked on the Apollo missions, Andrea. And his notes suggest he might have, well, taken some equipment. Stored it somewhere on the property. Taken as in stolen?" Andrea's voice rose with concern. "I don't know. Maybe salvaged is a better word?" NASA discarded a lot of equipment after the program ended. His notes suggest it was all documented and preserved. "Mom, even if there is something up there, it could get you in trouble. Government property, NASA. This sounds like a mess you don't need right now. You need to focus on your treatments and finding a new job." Eleanor sighed. "I know it sounds crazy. But what if there's something valuable? Something that could help with the medical bills?" "That's a fantasy, Mom. The reality is a rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere with huge tax problems. Please, just talk to the lawyer about disclaiming the inheritance." The second call was to a former colleague, Dr. James Henderson, who had taught history at the community college where Eleanor had worked. His specialty was American history, with a focus on the space race era. "Eleanor, this is fascinating," Dr. Henderson said after she'd explained her discovery. "The Apollo program generated enormous amounts of equipment, and not all of it was carefully tracked after the missions ended. There were contractors who worked on recovery and salvage operations. If your uncle was involved in that capacity, he might have legitimately had access to decommissioned equipment. Would any of it be valuable?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. "Potentially, yes. There's a significant market for authentic space program artifacts. Museums, private collectors, even educational institutions pay substantial amounts for documented Apollo-era equipment. But without proper authentication and provenance, it would be challenging to sell anything legally. And if these items weren't exactly officially decommissioned?" Dr. Henderson was quiet for a moment. "That would complicate matters. But interestingly, NASA has occasionally granted amnesty for returned items that left their possession through unofficial channels. Their primary interest is often in documenting and preserving the historical artifacts rather than prosecuting." This conversation left Eleanor with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense of determination. Despite her daughter's concerns and her own precarious situation, she decided to spend more time investigating the property before making any decisions. Eleanor's financial situation was growing increasingly dire. Her next round of cancer treatments would consume most of her remaining savings, and the property taxes on the mountain land would require nearly all the rest. But something about Uncle Walter's mysterious legacy called to her. Perhaps it was a connection to the family she'd never really had. Or perhaps it was simply the desperate hope of finding something valuable enough to change her circumstances. The reaction from her friends and family was swift and united in opposition. Andrea called daily, alternating between concern and frustration. "Mom, this is your health we're talking about. You can't gamble with that for some wild treasure hunt. Her friend Susan, who had supported her through the initial cancer diagnosis, was equally blunt. Ellie, I love you, but this sounds like denial. You're focusing on this mystery to avoid dealing with your real problems. Even her oncologist, Dr. Patel, expressed concern about the stress of taking on such a project during treatment. Ms. Mitchell, stress and exhaustion can impact your body's ability to recover from the treatments. I strongly advise focusing on your health right now. But Eleanor had made her decision. I need to know what's up there, she told Susan over coffee. If I'm going to lose everything anyway, at least I'll solve this mystery first. Eleanor made arrangements to stay in the small town nearest to the property during her weeks between treatments. She found an affordable long-term rental in a small guest house owned by a retired couple, the Andersons, who were intrigued by her story and supportive of her quest. Walter Mitchell was always a mystery around here, Mr. Anderson told her one evening. People said he knew things about the government that made them want to keep him quiet. Most folks thought he was just a conspiracy theorist, but he was always kind to us. Helped me fix my tractor once. Had a real engineer's mind. Did he ever mention anything about storing equipment on his property? Eleanor asked. Mrs. Anderson thought for a moment. Not specifically, but he was always hauling things up that mountain. Had an old truck with a winch. Sometimes he'd come to town for supplies and leave with some strange equipment. People just figured it was part of his eccentric lifestyle. With each visit to the cabin, Eleanor became more convinced that Uncle Walter had been involved in something significant. She discovered more notebooks filled with detailed inventory lists of equipment parts, serial numbers, and storage conditions. Many entries referenced the repository and included meticulous notes on temperature, humidity, and preservation techniques. Eleanor began the painstaking process of organizing and cataloging Walter's papers, creating a timeline of his activities. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Walter Mitchell had worked for Northrop, a contractor for NASA, from 1965 to 1978. His specialty was in recovery and salvage operations for space program equipment. After the Apollo program ended, he had been part of the team responsible for determining which equipment would be preserved, repurposed, or discarded. According to his notes, Walter had become concerned about the historical significance of equipment being scrapped. He had apparently taken it upon himself to rescue certain items that were slated for destruction, carefully documenting each piece and preserving it according to NASA's own protocols. But where was this equipment? Walter's notes repeatedly mentioned the repository and storage site Alpha, but gave no clear indication of its location beyond the marked X on the crude map. Eleanor had explored the area behind the cabin several times but found nothing that resembled a storage facility. The breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon in early October, nearly 3 months after Eleanor had first visited the property. She had been going through a box of her uncle's personal effects and found an old photograph album. Most of the photos were unremarkable landscapes, wildlife, and occasional self-portraits of Walter in various outdoor settings. But one series of photos caught her attention. They showed Walter standing beside what appeared to be a large rock outcropping on the mountainside. In the first photo, he was simply standing there. In the second, he was pulling on what looked like an ordinary rock. In the third, the rock had swung outward, revealing what appeared to be an entrance to a cave or tunnel. Eleanor's heart raced. She recognized the rock formation from her explorations of the property. It was about a quarter mile up the slope behind the cabin, in the general vicinity of the X on Walter's map. Despite the rain, Eleanor pulled on a jacket and hiking boots and set out to find the spot from the photograph. The climb was steep and slippery, and her body, weakened by cancer treatments, protested every step. But determination drove her forward. It took nearly an hour of searching before she found the rock formation. It matched the photograph perfectly, a distinctive outcropping that jutted from the mountainside. partially concealed by pine trees. Eleanor examined the rocks carefully, looking for anything that might serve as a handle or lever like in the photograph. Nothing seemed to move. She pushed and pulled on various rocks until her hands were scraped and sore. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a small metal plate almost completely concealed by moss at the base of the formation. Clearing away the growth revealed what appeared to be a keyhole. Eleanor remembered the ring of keys that had been in the lawyer's packet. She had assumed they were for various outbuildings on the property. She hurried back to the cabin, retrieved the keys, and returned to the rock formation. The fifth key she tried fit perfectly into the lock. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned it. There was a mechanical click, followed by the sound of gears moving inside the rock. Slowly, a section of the seemingly solid rock face swung outward, revealing a dark opening beyond. Eleanor stood frozen in amazement. Her uncle had built a hidden door in the mountainside, disguised as a natural rock formation. The engineering required for such a feat was impressive, especially in this remote location. She retrieved the flashlight from her backpack and cautiously stepped into the opening. A short tunnel, reinforced with timber supports like a mine shaft, led deeper into the mountain. The air was cool but not damp, and remarkably fresh for an enclosed space, suggesting some form of ventilation system. After about 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a large chamber that took Eleanor's breath away. The space was approximately 30 feet wide and stretched back into darkness beyond the reach of her flashlight. But what the light did reveal was astonishing. The chamber was filled with shelves, storage containers, and equipment racks, all meticulously organized and labeled. Some items were covered with protective tarps, others sealed in what appeared to be specialized storage containers. At the entrance to the chamber was a desk with a logbook and what looked like an old-fashioned control panel with various gauges and switches. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the logbook. The first page contained Walter's neat handwriting: Repository Inventory and Condition Log, Apollo Program Salvage and Preservation Project, Walter Mitchell, Custodian. Eleanor played her flashlight around the chamber, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. There were components that looked like they belonged in spacecraft: control panels, communication equipment, computer systems from the 1960s and 70s. Some items were recognizable from photos she'd seen of the Apollo missions, devices that resembled the control panels from the lunar module, sections that could have been part of spacesuits, and countless smaller components in sealed containers. Everything was meticulously labeled with NASA part numbers, mission designations, and dates. This was no random collection of souvenirs or stolen items. This was a carefully preserved archive of space program technology, maintained with museum quality. Attention to detail. As Eleanor explored further, she found another chamber beyond the first, and then a third. The complex was larger than she could have imagined, stretching deep into the mountainside. The further chambers contained larger equipment, including what appeared to be an entire guidance system from an Apollo spacecraft and components from the lunar rover. On one shelf, sealed in a climate-controlled case, were items labeled lunar surface samples, Apollo 15 inches, and Apollo 17 geological collection tools. If authentic, these alone would be of immense scientific and historical value. Eleanor's mind reeled with the implications of what she had discovered. Her uncle had created a private museum of Apollo program artifacts, hidden inside a mountain in Colorado. The collection was enormous, comprehensive, and appeared to have been maintained in pristine condition for decades. But the questions were overwhelming. How had Walter acquired all this equipment? Was it legally obtained? What would NASA say if they knew about this hidden repository? And perhaps most pressingly for Eleanor's situation, what was it all worth, and could she legally claim ownership? As darkness fell outside, Eleanor realized she needed to leave the repository before navigating the treacherous path back to the cabin became impossible. She carefully closed and locked the hidden door, making sure it was properly concealed as it had been for decades. Back at the cabin, Eleanor sat at Walter's desk, surrounded by his notebooks, trying to process her discovery. She had stumbled upon what might be one of the most significant private collections of space program artifacts in existence. But she had also uncovered a potential legal nightmare that could result in criminal charges rather than financial salvation. That night, as rain pounded on the cabin's roof, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. Instead of keeping the discovery secret or attempting to sell the artifacts quietly, she would seek expert advice and try to determine the legal and ethical path forward. She had no idea that within 6 months, her discovery would lead to one of the most extraordinary collaborations between a private citizen and NASA in recent history. She had no idea that her desperate search for some value in her unwanted inheritance would uncover secrets that had been hidden for nearly 50 years. All she knew was that her uncle's legacy was far more complex and valuable than anyone could have imagined. And for the first time since her cancer diagnosis, Eleanor Mitchell felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Eleanor's decision to fully explore the hidden repository marked a turning point in her life. For the first time since inheriting the mountain property, she felt a sense of purpose overriding her fears. The morning after discovering the hidden door, she woke before dawn, her mind racing with plans. Despite the lingering fatigue from her recent cancer treatment, she felt an energy that had been absent for months. "I need to document everything properly," she told herself, organizing supplies on the cabin's worn wooden table. She gathered notebooks, a digital camera she'd brought to photograph the property, measuring tape, and gloves to handle potentially delicate items. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pine trees, Eleanor began the steep hike back to the hidden entrance. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage. Eleanor moved slowly but deliberately, conserving her energy for the work ahead. Her oncologist would have strongly disapproved of this physical exertion so soon after treatment, but Eleanor felt driven by something stronger than medical advice. "The universe doesn't send opportunities when it's convenient," she murmured to herself, pausing to catch her breath. The cancer diagnosis had initially felt like the end of her story now. Strangely, this inheritance and discovery felt like the beginning of something new. At the rock formation, Eleanor carefully unlocked the hidden door, which swung open with surprising smoothness considering its age. Walter had clearly engineered it with precision and maintained it meticulously during his lifetime. Inside, Eleanor set up a battery-powered lantern that illuminated the main chamber far better than her flashlight had the previous day. In the improved light, the true extent of Walter's collection became clear. The repository wasn't just a storage space, it was a carefully designed preservation facility. Temperature and humidity gauges lined the walls, along with what appeared to be a passive ventilation system that kept the air surprisingly fresh. The shelving systems were custom-built to hold specific items, with shock-absorbing materials protecting delicate components. Eleanor began a systematic documentation process, starting with the main logbook she'd found on the desk. It contained detailed entries spanning from 1973 to 2012, just 2 years before Walter's death. Each entry noted inspection dates, condition assessments, and occasionally, restoration work performed on specific items. The earliest entry, dated September 17, 1973, provided crucial context: repository construction complete. Environmental controls installed and calibrated to NASA preservation standards. Ready to receive Phase 1 materials from White Sands decommissioning. As Eleanor read through the logbook, a narrative emerged that both complicated and clarified her understanding of what she'd found. Walter Mitchell hadn't simply stolen NASA equipment. He had been part of an official salvage and decommissioning team after the Apollo program ended. His notes indicated that he had received permission to preserve certain items that were slated for destruction or scrapping. An entry from March 1974 stated, "Items officially listed as destroyed in NASA. Inventory now secure in repository. All materials properly decontaminated and preserved according to Protocol 7A. Documentation and photographs secured in Vault B." But as the years progressed, Walter's operation seemed to have expanded beyond officially sanctioned salvage. Entries from the late 1970s referenced recovering items from storage facilities that were being cleared out, often with cryptic notes about administrative oversight and preservation priority. "Oh, Uncle Walter," Eleanor sighed. "What exactly were you doing?" The answers lay in the deeper sections of the repository. Eleanor moved systematically through the chambers, photographing everything and making her own inventory notes. The second chamber contained larger equipment components, including what appeared to be an entire guidance computer from an Apollo command module and several pieces of lunar surface equipment. The third chamber, the largest and deepest in the mountain, held the most astonishing items. Here, carefully preserved in climate-controlled cases, were what appeared to be complete spacesuits, or at least components of them, bearing NASA serial numbers. One case contained containers labeled lunar surface samples, with mission numbers corresponding to Apollo 15 and 17. If authentic, these items weren't just valuable, they were priceless historical artifacts of immense scientific importance, and potentially the subject of a major federal investigation if discovered improperly. After 7 hours of careful documentation, Eleanor had filled 3 notebooks with inventory lists and taken over 400 photographs. Her body ached with fatigue, but her mind was racing faster than ever. The scale of what Walter had preserved was staggering, easily hundreds of items, many of which appeared to be significant artifacts from one of humanity's greatest achievements. Back at the cabin that evening, Eleanor faced the most difficult decision of her life. The repository contents, if authentic and legally saleable, could be worth millions. Even a small portion could cover her medical expenses, the property taxes, and provide financial security for years to come. But the legal implications were daunting, potentially including federal charges for possession of government property. Moreover, she had begun to understand that Walter hadn't created this repository for financial gain. His meticulous preservation efforts and detailed documentation suggested a man on a mission to protect historical artifacts that might otherwise have been destroyed. Selling the items privately would betray that purpose. Also in the vault was a small box containing what appeared to be lunar dust and tiny rock fragments in sealed containers, carefully labeled with mission numbers. These were not large enough to be from the official lunar samples, but rather appeared to be residual material collected from equipment and spacesuits after the missions. Even these trace samples have significant scientific value, Dr. Rivera explained. The lunar material NASA brought back is incredibly limited, and every authenticated grain is precious for research. The NASA team spent hours documenting these final discoveries, their excitement palpable. For Eleanor, watching these experts validate Walter's life's work brought an unexpected sense of pride and connection to the uncle she'd never known. Evening, as the team finalized their reports and recommendations, Eleanor sat alone on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant gold and crimson. 6 months ago, her life had been collapsing around her, job gone, health failing, future uncertain. This inheritance had initially seemed like one more burden in an already overwhelming time. Now and probably, it had become her salvation, not just financially, but spiritually. Walter's passion and purpose had reached across time to give her a new direction when she'd needed it most. Eleanor's phone rang, interrupting her reflections. It was Andrea, calling from Seattle. "Mom, how are things going with the NASA people?" "This still sounds completely unbelievable to me." Eleanor smiled. "It's real, Andrea, all of it. They're calling it one of the most significant private collections of Apollo artifacts ever discovered. Uncle Walter spent decades preserving this history, and now we get to share it with the world. And they're really going to hire you as the curator? No offense, Mom, but you worked in college administration. What do you know about space artifacts? I'm learning, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. And I know something more important. I understand why Walter did this. He saw value in things others were discarding. He recognized that sometimes what looks like junk to one generation will be priceless to the next. There was a pause before Andrea spoke again. You sound different, Mom, stronger. I feel different, Eleanor admitted. Finding this collection, understanding what Walter accomplished, it's changed how I see things. My cancer, this inheritance, they aren't just problems to solve. They're part of a bigger story. As she ended the call, Eleanor looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, human footprints remained on the lunar surface, undisturbed after all these decades. Walter had dedicated his life to preserving the artifacts of that journey. Now improbably, that legacy had given her a new purpose when she'd needed it most. Eleanor Mitchell had inherited far more than a mountain property with tax problems. She had inherited a mission to share with the world the treasures one man had recognized when everyone else saw only junk destined for scrap heaps. In saving these artifacts, Walter Mitchell had unknowingly thrown a lifeline across time to the niece he'd never met, providing not just financial salvation, but something far more valuable, purpose. The mountain night grew cold around her, but Eleanor felt warmer than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, but also more discoveries. The repository had not yet revealed all its secrets, and Eleanor was just beginning to understand the full extent of her inheritance. The cancer might still claim her life eventually, but now she had something worth fighting for, a legacy larger than herself, connecting past to future through the artifacts of humanity's greatest adventure. The public announcement of the Walter Mitchell Apollo Preservation Archive came on a crisp October morning, 6 months after Eleanor had first discovered the hidden repository. The press conference, held at the Space History Museum in Denver, drew media from across the country. Eleanor sat between Dr. Rivera and Dr. Chun at a long table, facing a room packed with journalists, cameras, and recording equipment. Today, we announce the discovery of one of the most significant private collections of Apollo program artifacts ever documented. Dr. Chun began, his voice steady despite his evident excitement. Preserved for nearly 50 years in a specialized facility, these items represent an unprecedented time capsule of America's journey to the moon. As screens behind them displayed carefully selected photographs of the collection, Eleanor watched. The reporters' faces transformed from professional interest to genuine awe. These weren't just old spare parts. They were tangible connections to humanity's greatest adventure, preserved with museum-quality care when they might otherwise have been lost forever. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she felt a momentary panic. 6 months ago, she had been an anonymous administrative assistant facing a cancer diagnosis. Now she was addressing a national audience as the inheritor and curator of a historic treasure. The journey from that desperate woman sitting in the county assessor's office to this podium seemed as improbable as the journey from Earth to the moon had once been. My uncle Walter Mitchell dedicated his life to preserving these artifacts, Eleanor began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. He understood something that we often forget, that history isn't just preserved in official museums and institutions. Sometimes it's saved by individuals who recognize value where others see only obsolescence. A reporter raised her hand. Ms. Mitchell, NASA records indicate many of these items were officially documented as destroyed or scrapped. Was your uncle essentially stealing government property? Eleanor had anticipated this question. Diana Foster, the NASA lawyer, had prepared her carefully for it. Walter Mitchell was officially employed in decommissioning operations after the Apollo program ended, Eleanor explained. During a time of budget cuts and changing priorities, he took extraordinary measures to ensure historically significant items weren't lost forever. NASA has reviewed his extensive documentation and determined that his preservation efforts, while unorthodox, ultimately served the public interest in preserving this irreplaceable history. Dr. Chun nodded in agreement. I'd like to add that Mr. Mitchell maintained meticulous records documenting the provenance of every item. His preservation methods actually exceeded NASA's own standards in many cases. Rather than condemning his actions, we're celebrating his foresight. Another reporter stood. What's the estimated value of the collection? That's complicated, Dr. Rivera interjected. The market value of authenticated Apollo artifacts is substantial. Similar items have sold at auction for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. But the true value of this collection lies in its comprehensive nature and perfect preservation. Some items are genuinely priceless in historical terms. As the questions continued, Eleanor realized that her life had been transformed irrevocably. The inheritance that had once seemed like a burden, a remote property with tax problems, had become the foundation for something extraordinary. Her cancer treatments continued, but now she faced them with renewed purpose and the financial security provided by the conservation grant and her position as the collection's initial curator. After the press conference, Dr. Chun took Eleanor aside. You did wonderfully, he said warmly. Your uncle would be proud. The Smithsonian is extremely excited about receiving some of the key pieces, but we want to do this right. The transition will be gradual, with proper credit to Walter and your role in bringing this collection to light. I'm still trying to process all of this, Eleanor admitted. 6 months ago, I was worried about paying for my cancer treatments. Now I'm discussing artifact preservation with the Smithsonian. Dr. Chun smiled. Life can change direction in remarkable ways. Your uncle understood that better than most. He saw value and purpose where others saw only junk and waste. The media coverage of the discovery was immediate and extensive. Hidden moon treasures found in mountain hideaway, declared the Denver Post. Secret Apollo archive discovered after nearly 50 years, announced National Geographic. Cancer survivor uncovers $1 million NASA artifacts and inherited property, proclaimed USA Today, simplifying Eleanor's story but capturing its dramatic arc. Within days, Eleanor was fielding interview requests from major networks, podcasts, and publications around the world. Everyone wanted to hear about the treasure in the mountain and the remarkable man who had created it. Walter Mitchell, once known only as the eccentric recluse, Mountain Mitchell, was rapidly becoming a folk hero in the space history community, a man who had quietly saved irreplaceable artifacts when institutional priorities had shifted away from preservation. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the Apollo program itself, with many articles using the found artifacts as a launching point to discuss humanity's achievements in space exploration. Educators particularly embraced the story, seeing it as a way to engage young people with both history and science. But the most significant impact was on Eleanor herself, the woman who had reluctantly visited her inherited property, expecting to find nothing of value, had discovered not just physical artifacts but a connection to her unknown uncle and a new purpose for her own life. 3 weeks after the press conference, Eleanor sat in Dr. Patel's office, waiting for the results of her latest scans. The stress of the discovery and subsequent media attention had been considerable, but it had also given her a reason to fight harder against her cancer. Your scans are encouraging, Dr. Patel said, studying the images on her computer screen. The tumors have responded well to treatment. I'd say you're on track for full remission if this continues. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. That's wonderful news. I have to ask, Dr. Patel said with a small smile, do you think Finding a multi-million-dollar treasure helped your recovery? I don't usually get to prescribe that as treatment. Eleanor laughed. It wasn't just the financial security, though that certainly reduced my stress. It was finding a purpose, understanding that I could continue something important that someone else had started. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with what we know about successful recovery. Patients who find meaning and purpose during treatment often do better than those who don't. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, work on the collection intensified. The NASA team had established a temporary conservation laboratory in the town nearest to the property, where items could be carefully examined, documented, and prepared for eventual transfer to permanent museum homes. Eleanor divided her time between her apartment in town and the mountain cabin, which she had begun renovating with some of the grant money. The leaking roof was repaired, a reliable solar power system installed, and the plumbing modernized. What had initially seemed like an uninhabitable relic became a comfortable retreat, where she could connect with the uncle she'd never known. In Walter's journals, which she continued to study in the evenings, Eleanor discovered a man of remarkable complexity. He had indeed started his preservation work with official sanction, salvaging items that NASA had designated for disposal. But as budget cuts intensified and more historic artifacts faced destruction, his mission had evolved into something more personal and unauthorized. A journal entry from 1978 was particularly revealing. Witness the scrapping of LM training module components today. Parts identical to those that carried humans to another world, being thrown into dumpsters. Official policy is to prioritize forward-looking programs, not nostalgia. Cannot accept this short-sightedness. Salvaged key components after hours. Will add to repository collection. History will vindicate this decision. Walter had been right. History had vindicated his unauthorized preservation efforts. The items he had rescued from dumpsters and scrap heaps were now being celebrated as irreplaceable treasures by the very institution that had once discarded them. As Christmas approached, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at the cabin. Andrea. Her daughter had flown in from Seattle to see firsthand what had transformed her mother's life so dramatically. I still can't believe this is real, Andrea said as they hiked up to the repository entrance. When you first told me about inheriting this property, I thought it was the worst possible timing with your diagnosis. So did I, Eleanor admitted. I was ready to walk away from it all. Something made me take a closer look. When Eleanor unlocked the hidden door and led Andrea into the repository, her daughter's reaction echoed what Eleanor had felt months earlier: shock, disbelief, and gradually, awe. Uncle Walter built all this by himself? Andrea asked, running her hand along the custom shelving systems that held containers of Apollo components. As far as we can tell, the construction alone represents years of work, not to mention the preservation systems and the collection itself. Andrea stopped before a display case containing what appeared to be part of a spacesuit glove. And he did all this knowing that no one might ever see it, that he might die without anyone discovering what he'd created. I think that possibility bothered him near the end, Eleanor said, remembering entries from Walter's later journals. He started leaving more explicit clues in his papers. The photograph album that led me to the entrance was placed where it would likely be found. I think he was hoping someone would continue his work. Andrea was quiet for a moment, studying her mother's face. You look better than you have in years, Mom, even with everything you've been through with the cancer. I feel better, Eleanor acknowledged. Having this purpose has changed everything. I'm not just fighting to survive, I'm fighting to complete something important. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the renovated cabin, Andrea raised the question Eleanor had been considering herself. What happens when the collection is fully documented and transferred to museums? Will you go back to administrative work? Eleanor shook her head. I don't think so. This experience has opened a door I didn't know existed. Dr. Rivera has suggested I might consider a degree in museum studies or history. Several universities have already expressed interest in having me speak about the discovery. At 56? You'd start a whole new career? Why not? Eleanor smiled. Uncle Walter was still adding to his collection well into his 80s. Age is just a number, especially when you face the possibility that you might not have much time left. As winter gave way to spring, the work of documenting and preserving the collection continued. Each item required careful handling, professional photography, and detailed condition reports before it could be prepared for transfer. The most significant pieces would go to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, while others would be distributed to space museums around the country, always with recognition of Walter Mitchell's preservation work. Eleanor's role evolved from simply providing access to the collection to becoming an active participant in the conservation process. Under Dr. Rivera's guidance, she learned proper handling techniques for delicate artifacts, documentation standards, and the principles of museum quality preservation. You have a natural aptitude for this work, Dr. Rivera observed one afternoon as they carefully cleaned corrosion from a circuit board that had once been destined for an Apollo command module. Your attention to detail reminds me of your uncle's. Notes: I never thought I'd find a new career at this stage of my life, Eleanor admitted, especially one that requires such specialized knowledge. The best curators combine technical knowledge with passion for their subject matter, Dr. Rivera replied. You already have the passion, and you're acquiring the technical skills remarkably quickly. By summer, the first major pieces from the collection were ready for transfer to their permanent homes. The Smithsonian sent a specialized team to handle the most valuable artifacts, including the Apollo 11 lunar module control panel components and the trace lunar samples that Walter had preserved. The transfer ceremony was covered by national media, with Eleanor handing over the first artifacts to the Smithsonian's representative in a symbolic gesture of passing Walter's legacy to the institution that would preserve it for future generations. These artifacts will be displayed with full recognition of Walter Mitchell's role in their preservation, the Smithsonian curator announced. A permanent exhibit titled The Mitchell Moon Legacy will tell the story of how one man's foresight saved these irreplaceable treasures for future generations. For Eleanor, the moment was bittersweet. She felt immense pride in seeing her uncle's work recognized at the highest levels, but also a sense of loss as the collection he had so carefully assembled began to disperse to various institutions. Dr. Chun sensed her mixed emotions. This isn't an ending, he told her after the ceremony. It's a transformation. Walter preserved these artifacts for decades in a hidden repository seen by only one person. Now they'll be viewed by millions, inspiring new generations to look up at the moon and remember what humanity accomplished. Eleanor nodded, finding comfort in this perspective. He would have wanted that. His journals make it clear that preservation was always the goal, not possession. As the summer progressed, Eleanor's health continued to improve. Her cancer responded well to treatment, eventually reaching full remission. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, scheduling regular follow-ups but encouraging her to think long-term again. With her health stabilizing and her financial situation secured through the NASA conservation grant, Eleanor made a decision about the mountain property. Rather than selling it once the collection was transferred, she would keep it and continue the renovations. The cabin that had once seemed an unwanted burden had become a retreat, where she felt connected to the uncle she'd never met, but had come to know through his life's work. In August, almost exactly 1 year after she had first visited the property, Eleanor received a letter from the director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Dear Ms. Mitchell, it is my pleasure to invite you to the opening ceremony of the Mitchell Moon Legacy exhibit at our Washington, D.C. facility on October 15th. This permanent installation will showcase the remarkable artifacts preserved by your uncle and brought to light through your efforts. Additionally, we would like to offer you a position as a special consultant to the museum on matters relating to the Mitchell collection. Your unique perspective and growing expertise would be invaluable as we continue to study and present these artifacts. The story of Walter Mitchell's preservation efforts and your discovery represents the kind of personal connection to history that our institution strives to foster. We would be honored to have you join us in continuing this important work. Eleanor read the letter twice, hardly believing what it offered. From administrative assistant to Smithsonian consultant in just 1 year, a transformation as improbable as finding Apollo treasures hidden in a mountain. That evening she hiked up to the repository entrance one last time before the final artifacts would be removed. The hidden door had been permanently modified for easier access during the cataloging process, though it still maintained its clever disguise within the rock face. Inside, many of the shelves now stood empty, their contents carefully packed and transferred to museum conservation facilities. The space that had once been packed with history's treasures echoed with emptiness, but Eleanor didn't feel sadness. Walter's mission had been fulfilled. The artifacts were preserved, documented, and would soon be shared with the world. On a shelf near the entrance, Eleanor had placed a framed photograph of Walter that she'd found among his papers, a younger version of the uncle she'd never met, standing proudly beside an Apollo-era NASA display. Beside it, she placed a new photograph, herself at the transfer ceremony, handing over the first artifacts to the Smithsonian. Past and present connected through a shared purpose, the recognition that sometimes value isn't measured in dollars, but in the connections that bind humanity to its greatest achievements. Walter had understood this when he began his preservation work in the 1970s. Now Eleanor understood it too. As she locked the repository for what might be the last time, Eleanor thought about the unlikely chain of events that had led her here. Cancer had seemed like the end of her story, and an inherited property with tax problems had seemed like one more burden. Instead, they had become the catalyst for the most meaningful chapter of her life. Walking back down the mountain path, Eleanor paused to look up at the sky. Somewhere up there, on the lunar surface, boot prints remained undisturbed after more than 50 years, testament to humanity's greatest journey. Thanks to Walter Mitchell, many artifacts from that journey had been preserved when they might otherwise have been lost. And thanks to an inheritance that had initially seemed worthless, Eleanor Mitchell had found not just financial salvation, but something far more valuable: purpose, connection, and a legacy that would outlive her. The mountain air was sweet with pine and possibility. Ahead lay a future she could never have imagined a year ago: cancer in remission, financial security established, and a new career path opening before her. Behind lay the hidden repository, its mission accomplished, its treasures soon to inspire millions. Eleanor smiled as she continued down the path. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones that can be measured in dollars. Sometimes they're measured in purpose, in connection to something larger than ourselves, in the opportunity to continue a mission that spans generations. Walter Mitchell had understood this truth. Now Eleanor Mitchell did too. 5 years after, Eleanor Mitchell reluctantly visited her inherited mountain property. She stood before a capacity crowd at the National Air and Space Museum's main hall in Washington, D.C., the audience a mix of NASA veterans, space enthusiasts, museum curators, and schoolchildren on field trips had gathered for the 5th anniversary celebration of the Mitchell Moon Legacy exhibit, now one of the museum's most popular permanent installations. When I first set foot on my uncle's property, Eleanor began, her voice carrying confidently through the hall, I was a desperate woman facing cancer, unemployment, and financial ruin. The last thing I wanted was an inherited cabin with tax problems. She paused as soft laughter rippled through the audience. I had no idea that reluctant first visit would transform not just my circumstances, but my understanding of what gives life meaning. At 61, Eleanor Mitchell had become something of a celebrity in the space history community. Her silver-streaked brown hair was cut in a stylish bob, and she wore a blazer with a custom-designed lapel pin featuring the Apollo mission patch, alongside a mountain silhouette gift from the museum staff, commemorating the unique journey that had brought Walter's collection to the public. The Mitchell Moon Legacy exhibit had exceeded all expectations. In 5 years, over 12 million visitors had experienced the carefully preserved Apollo artifacts, learning not only about humanity's journey to the moon, but also about one man's determination to preserve that legacy when institutional priorities had shifted elsewhere. My Uncle Walter understood something profound, Eleanor continued, gesturing toward the exhibit behind her where visitors could view components from lunar modules, spacesuits, and control systems, all preserved in pristine condition. He recognized that history isn't just preserved in official archives and institutions. Sometimes it's saved by individuals who see value where others see only obsolescence. The exhibit's centerpiece, a reconstructed section of a lunar module training simulator containing controls identical to those used in the actual moon landings, gleamed under museum lighting. Beside it stood a life-sized photograph of Walter Mitchell in his NASA contractor uniform, paired with a similar photo of Eleanor on the day the collection was officially transferred to the Smithsonian. People often ask me what this collection is worth in dollars, Eleanor said, her voice softening. The answer is many millions, certainly, but the true value can't be measured that way. The real worth lies in the connections these artifacts create between past and future, between achievement and inspiration, between one generation's accomplishments and another's dreams. As Eleanor spoke, she noticed a familiar face in the front row, Andrea, now 38, sitting beside her own daughter, Sophie, age 8. Beside them sat Dr. Rivera, Dr. Chun, and several of the original team members who had helped document the collection. Even Diana Foster, the NASA lawyer who had helped navigate the complex legal issues surrounding the discovery, had come for the anniversary. 5 years ago, we celebrated the transfer of these artifacts to their permanent home, Eleanor continued. Today, I'm thrilled to announce the next chapter in the Mitchell legacy. A murmur of interest passed through the crowd. The Walter and Eleanor Mitchell Foundation for Space Preservation will launch next month, with initial funding of $10 million, she announced. This foundation will support grassroots preservation efforts, assist private collectors in properly documenting space artifacts, and provide grants to individuals working to save our space exploration heritage outside of traditional institutional frameworks. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. The foundation represented years of planning, bringing together Eleanor's NASA consulting fees, a portion of the compensation she'd received for Walter's collection, and matching grants from several technology billionaires who had been inspired by the Mitchell story. My uncle worked alone for decades, believing that future generations would value what his contemporaries were discarding, Eleanor said as the applause subsided. The foundation ensures that other Walter Mitchells out there, individuals working to preserve important artifacts outside of institutional settings, will have the support and recognition they deserve. After the ceremony, Eleanor made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about the new foundation. A NASA historian wanted to discuss a cache of early space shuttle design documents recently discovered in a retired engineer's garage. A museum curator from Houston had questions about preservation techniques for degrading plastics in 1960s-era electronics. A group of high school students wanted advice on careers in space history and artifact conservation. Andrea approached with young Sophie, who was clutching a space shuttle model purchased from the museum gift shop. "That was incredible, Mom," Andrea said, embracing Eleanor. "Dad would have been so proud of you." Eleanor smiled at the mention of her late husband, who had passed away before her cancer diagnosis. "He would have thought I was crazy for keeping that property," she said, with a gentle laugh. "But I think he would have come around eventually." Sophie tugged at Eleanor's blazer. "Grandma, are you really famous?" "My teacher said we were studying your collection because you're famous." Eleanor knelt to her granddaughter's level. "I'm not famous, sweetie. I just happened to find something important that someone else saved. The famous people are the astronauts who went to the moon and the thousands of people who made that possible." "But you saved it so people could see it," Sophie insisted with the straightforward logic of childhood. "That's important too." Dr. Rivera, who had overheard the exchange, joined them. "Your grandmother is being modest, Sophie. What she did was extraordinary. Most people would have sold those artifacts piece by piece to private collectors. The Mitchell collection would have been scattered across the world, its historical context lost. Instead, she ensured it would be preserved intact for future generations, for children like you." Later that evening, the museum hosted a private reception for those most closely involved with the Mitchell collection. The event was held in a special viewing area overlooking the main exhibit hall, where visitors could still be seen examining the displays despite the late hour. Dr. Chun raised a glass in toast. "To Walter Mitchell, whose foresight preserved these treasures, and to Eleanor Mitchell, who brought them into the light." As glasses clinked, Eleanor felt a surge of emotion. 5 years ago, standing in that mountain repository for the first time, she could never have imagined this moment: cancer in remission, financial security established, and a new career that had given her life unexpected purpose and meaning. Dr. Rivera sidled up beside her. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about how completely my life changed because of that inheritance," Eleanor replied. "When the lawyer called about Uncle Walter's property, I thought it was the worst possible timing with my diagnosis and financial problems. And now I understand it was precisely the right timing. When everything was falling apart, I found something that gave me a reason to keep going." Dr. Rivera nodded thoughtfully. "You know, in conservation work, we talk about the concept of the right environment for preservation. Walter created the perfect physical environment to preserve those artifacts: controlled temperature, humidity, security. But you created the perfect social environment for their preservation, bringing together experts, institutions, and public interest to ensure they'd be protected forever." The observation struck Eleanor as profound. "I never thought of it that way." "It's true," Dr. Rivera insisted. "The artifacts needed both environments to survive Walter's hidden repository for the first 50 years, and your public advocacy for their future." As the reception wound down, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the main exhibit hall. The museum was closing for the night, and the last visitors were being ushered toward the exits. She stood alone before the display case containing Walter's original logbook, open to an entry from 1974. "Future generations will understand the importance of what we accomplished. These artifacts must survive to tell the story." "He was right," came a voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find Diana Foster, the NASA lawyer who had helped navigate the complex legal issues surrounding the discovery. "About a lot of things," Eleanor agreed. "When we first met, I thought the legal issues would be insurmountable," Diana admitted. "Government property, unauthorized possession, potentially millions in value. It had all the ingredients for a legal nightmare." "What changed your mind?" "When I saw the preservation quality, the documentation, the clear intent. Walter Mitchell wasn't a thief. He was a conservator working without official sanction but with absolute dedication to the mission. NASA could have fought for ownership and won, but it would have been a Pyrrhic victory that missed the larger truth." They stood in comfortable silence, regarding the displayed artifacts, pieces of humanity's greatest adventure, rescued from scrap heaps and storage facilities when their value wasn't recognized. "You know," Deanna said finally, "your story has changed NASA's approach to historical artifacts. There's a new protocol now, the Mitchell Protocol they're calling it, for evaluating unofficial collections, and working with private preservationists rather than automatically treating them as adversaries. This was news to Eleanor. Really? I hadn't heard about that. Diana nodded. It's still in the implementation phase, but the principle is clear. Sometimes the people who recognize the value of historical artifacts aren't the ones officially tasked with preserving them. The goal should be preservation, not just establishing ownership. The museum's closing announcement echoed through the nearly empty hall. As they walked toward the exit, Diana added, "The first test case is happening now. A retired shuttle program engineer with a garage full of early design models and documentation. Instead of sending in agents with seizure warrants, we're sending historians and conservators to work collaboratively with him." The Walter Mitchell approach, Eleanor said with a smile. Exactly. Recognizing that preservation can happen in unexpected places by dedicated individuals. The next morning, Eleanor flew back to Colorado, where she still maintained her renovated cabin on the mountain property. Though her consultant work with the Smithsonian required frequent travel to Washington, the cabin remained her true home, the place where she felt closest to the uncle she'd never met but whose legacy had transformed her life. Spring was just beginning to touch the mountainside, with wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow near the cabin. Eleanor had expanded the original structure considerably, adding a modern office wing where she conducted her foundation work and a guest house for visiting researchers and family. Andrea and Sophie were arriving the following week for spring break, Sophie's first visit to the mountain property where the remarkable story had begun. Eleanor had planned a special surprise. With NASA's permission, she had brought home one small artifact from the collection, a lunar surface dust brush that had been considered redundant in the museum holdings. She would show it to Sophie and tell her the story of how it would have been used by astronauts on the lunar surface. As Eleanor unpacked in the cabin, her phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was Dr. Akira Tanaka, a curator at the National Space Center in Tokyo. "Dear Ms. Mitchell," the email began, "I am writing regarding a remarkable discovery here in Japan that may interest you. A former NASDA engineer, Hiroshi Watanabe, recently passed away at age 92. His family discovered what appears to be an extensive collection of preserved artifacts from Japan's early space program, dating back to the 1960s and 70s. Like your uncle, Mr. Watanabe appears to have recognized the historical significance of items scheduled for disposal and preserved them privately for decades. The Watanabe family has heard of your foundation and is hoping you might provide guidance on how best to proceed with this collection. Would you be willing to consult with them? Your experience with the Mitchell collection makes you uniquely qualified to assist in this matter." Eleanor felt a surge of excitement as she read the email. Another Walter Mitchell had been out there all along, quietly preserving space history on the other side of the world. How many more might exist dedicated individuals who had recognized the value of artifacts that institutions had once deemed disposable? This was exactly why she had created the foundation, to support these preservation efforts and ensure that important artifacts didn't remain hidden or become scattered when their caretakers passed away. She immediately wrote back accepting the invitation and suggesting a video conference with the Watanabe family as soon as possible. As she pressed send, Eleanor reflected on how completely her life had changed in 5 years. From administrative assistant to international consultant on space artifact preservation, a transformation as unlikely as finding Apollo treasures in a mountain hideaway. That evening, Eleanor sat on her expanded porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The air was crisp and pine-scented, carrying the promise of spring. From this vantage point, she could see the rock formation that concealed the entrance to Walter's repository, now empty of artifacts but maintained as a historic site in its own right. The repository had given up its treasures, but it had also given Eleanor something far more valuable, a second chance at life when her prospects had seemed bleakest. The cancer that had once threatened to end her story had become just one chapter in a much longer narrative. The inheritance that had seemed like a burden had become the foundation for an entirely new life purpose. Her phone chimed again, a text from Andrea with a photo of Sophie proudly holding a school project, a diorama of the lunar landing with a small figure labeled, Great Uncle Walter, standing beside the lunar module. She's so excited to see where it all happened, Andrea's text read. She told her entire class that her great-uncle saved the moon landing, and her grandmother made sure everyone could see it. Eleanor smiled at the child's simplified version of events. In many ways, Sophie had captured the essence of the story better than any museum placard or news article. Walter had indeed saved pieces of the moon landing when others were discarding them, and Eleanor had indeed helped ensure they would be preserved for future generations to see. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor thought about the 5-year journey that had transformed her from a desperate cancer patient to the founder of an international foundation. The path had not been easy or straightforward. There had been legal challenges, health setbacks, and moments of doubt along the way. But the sense of purpose that had begun with that first discovery had carried her through each obstacle. "Thank you, Uncle Walter," she said softly to the night air, "for seeing value where others didn't, for preserving what mattered when it wasn't popular to do so, and for leaving a legacy that reached across time to someone you never met, but somehow knew would understand." The stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, the same stars that had guided humanity's greatest journey of exploration. Somewhere up there, the moon shone down on a world that had briefly touched its surface and returned with stories and souvenirs of the adventure. Thanks to Walter Mitchell's foresight and Eleanor Mitchell's discovery, those souvenirs would continue, telling their story for generations to come. And thanks to the foundation that bore both their names, other preserved treasures would emerge from garages, attics, and hidden repositories around the world, adding new chapters to humanity's greatest adventure. The following week brought Andrea and Sophie to the mountain cabin. As they turned onto the property, Sophie pressed her face against the car window, eyes wide with anticipation. "Is that where the space treasure was, Mommy?" she asked, pointing toward the rocky slope behind the cabin. "That's it," Andrea confirmed. "Hidden in the mountain for almost 50 years until Grandma found it." Eleanor welcomed them with open arms, Sophie rushing to hug her with the unrestrained enthusiasm of childhood. The little girl's eyes darted around, taking in the cabin. "And the mountainside behind it. Can we see the secret door?" she asked immediately. "The one that great Uncle Walter built?" "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised, "when the light is better for hiking. Tonight I have something special to show you." After dinner in the cabin's renovated kitchen, Eleanor brought out a small display case. Inside, secured in a custom-fitted mounting, was the lunar dust brush, a simple tool that embodied humanity's most ambitious journey. This brush was identical to ones used by astronauts on the moon, Eleanor explained as Sophie stared wide-eyed at the artifact. When the lunar dust got on their equipment, they used brushes like this one to clean it off. "Real moon dust?" Sophie whispered. "Not on this particular brush," Eleanor clarified. "This was a training version, but identical brushes did touch. Lunar dust almost 50 years ago." Sophie looked up from the display case. "Did great Uncle Walter know I would want to see this someday?" The question caught Eleanor by surprise with its innocence and insight. "I don't think he knew you specifically," she said carefully. "But yes, in a way. He saved these things for children like you, for future generations who would want to understand what it meant to go to the moon." "I'm going to go to Mars," Sophie announced with absolute certainty. "And I'll make sure to save important things too, so people in the future will know how we did it." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. This, ultimately, was Walter's true legacy, not just preserved artifacts but preserved inspiration. The continuation of the dream of exploration across generations. The next morning, they hiked up to the repository entrance. Though the artifacts had long since been transferred to museums, Eleanor maintained the facility as a historical site, occasionally bringing special visitors to see where the collection had been hidden for decades. "It looks just like a regular rock," Sophie exclaimed, examining the cleverly disguised entrance. "That was the idea," Eleanor explained. "Uncle Walter wanted it to blend in perfectly with the mountainside." Eleanor unlocked the entrance, now fitted with a museum-quality security system, and led them inside. The temperature-controlled chambers were empty of artifacts now, but she had installed interpretive displays showing photographs of how the repository had looked when first discovered. "He built all this by himself?" Andrea asked, touching the custom shelving systems that had once held priceless artifacts. "As far as we can tell," Eleanor confirmed. "The construction alone represents years of work, not to mention the preservation systems." Sophie wandered the empty chamber with a child's curiosity, asking questions about each display and photograph. "Why didn't he tell people what he was doing?" she finally asked. Eleanor considered how to explain the complexities of Walter's situation to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "when you believe something is important but others don't see it the same way, you have to take care of it yourself until the world catches up to your vision." Sophie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Like how you took care of his collection when you found it, even though you were sick and everybody said you should sell the property." Eleanor exchanged a surprised glance with Andrea. "Yes, exactly. Like that. How did you know that part?" "Mom told me," Sophie said simply. "She said you were really brave because you were fighting cancer, but you still made sure Great-Uncle Walter's moon stuff was saved properly." As they emerged from the repository into the bright mountain sunshine, Eleanor felt a profound sense of continuity. Walter's mission had become her mission, and now it was inspiring Sophie's generation. The circle was complete preservation, leading to discovery, leading to new inspiration. "You know," Eleanor said as they walked back toward the cabin, "when I first inherited this property, everyone told me to sell it and walk away. It seemed worthless, just a rundown cabin with tax problems in the middle of nowhere." "But you didn't listen," Sophie said with admiration. "I almost didn't listen to myself," Eleanor admitted. "Sometimes the most valuable things don't look valuable at first glance. It takes a special kind of vision to see potential where others see only problems." As they reached the cabin, Eleanor paused to look back at the mountainside with its hidden repository. The inheritance that had once seemed like the worst possible timing, a burden when she was already overwhelmed with cancer and financial problems, had become the foundation for everything good in her life now. The most valuable inheritance isn't always the one that comes with a big price tag, she told Sophie. Sometimes it's the one that gives you purpose, that connects you to something larger than yourself, that helps you create meaning even from life's greatest challenges. Sophie looked thoughtful, taking in the mountain vista and the story it contained. "I think I understand," she said. "Great-Uncle Walter left you more than just moon stuff. He left you a mission." Eleanor smiled at the child's wisdom. "Yes, that's exactly right. And now that mission continues through the foundation, helping other hidden collections come to light." As the sun reached its zenith over the Colorado mountains, Eleanor Mitchell stood with her daughter and granddaughter, 3 generations connected by an inheritance that had transcended monetary value to become something far more precious. A legacy of purpose, preservation, and possibility that would continue inspiring long after all the artifacts had turned to dust. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.